So, A-Push Nation, if you finished off that 22-minute first video and you said to yourself, man, Mr. Majewski, this would be a real bad time for something bad to go on in the world, because if the United States is going to be super isolationist, and if we're going to sit there and stay out of world affairs and only focus on what's happening in the United States and withdraw not only from all world international events, but also kind of just withdraw from imperialism and start to give that up too, when bad things happen around the world, there's going to be nobody to stand up to them. Well, guess what? That's exactly what happens, of course. No peace organization like the League of Nations, that fell apart, right? No big guy there to challenge these bad boys, and so, of course, what happens? We see the rise of dictators, of totalitarians, as they're called, and they rise across Europe. It starts with a movement known as Fascism, right? Which kind of glorifies the state, it glorifies the leader, and it focuses on expanding into other countries. It starts with Benito Mussolini in Italy. There's also Adolf Hitler, who calls it Nazism or National Socialism, but it's the same thing, in Germany. And, of course, we get a military dictatorship in Japan as well. So those three countries all have separate dictators, and they all are going to end up allying together and teaming up to form what becomes known as the Axis. At the same time, separate from all that, we have communism in Russia, and, of course, that means Joseph Stalin takes over, and he's as ruthless as any of those other people. All of these folks are responsible for just mass slaughters in their country, as we later find out. And almost immediately, the expansion begins. All of those countries are involved in separate expansion. First, Japan invades part of China, known as Manchuria. The League is still around, but it does nothing to stop it. And, of course, the invasion violated all of those agreements the U.S. and the rest of the world had signed, but nobody did anything to stop it, so it proved how worthless those paper agreements were. The one response the U.S. did have to this invasion and seizure was we refused to recognize that that territory belonged to Japan. That did nothing to stop them, of course. They just simply took it anyways. Japan did withdraw from the League of Nations after this because, obviously, they realized it was kind of pointless to be a part of it any longer. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. Again, the League did nothing to stop it, again, showed kind of the weakness of the League and the lack of interest by the United States. So the isolationism in the U.S. really continued with FDR. His focus was on fixing the Depression, and so he didn't really want to get involved in international affairs. And he made that pretty clear early on. In 1933, there was a meeting of 66 countries to try to figure out a mutual response to the Great Depression. FDR sent a group to the meeting. The goal was to try to, how can we work together to fix some of these problems that the Depression has caused. FDR opposed some of the decisions that were being made, and so he ordered the American delegation to leave. When Hitler and Mussolini saw that FDR was not interested in working with the rest of Europe, that made them bolder, it made them more aggressive. They basically said, we know the U.S. and FDR aren't going to stop us, just like Hoover had not either. To make matters worse, in 1934, Congress launched what became known as the Nye Committee, and it kind of sunk the U.S. even further into isolationism, and here's why. Because what the Nye Committee did is it investigated rumors that had occurred from back in World War I. There was a belief after World War I that maybe we had been lied to, and the only reason we had gone to war was because weapons makers wanted us to so they could get rich. They were known as merchants of death. And so these rumors were kind of like, they were like viral. They refused to ever stop, even though it was like 20 years before. And so Congress finally, there was so much talk about this, Congress investigated, led by this guy named Gerald Nye, and lo and behold, he comes back and he says, yeah, the rumors were true. So, of course, that caused all the conspiracy theories to freak out. And it also led many people in this country to further believe that isolationism was the answer to avoid getting ourselves involved in any of these sort of ridiculous wars in the future. That leads to the Neutrality Act. So after every one of these conflicts that occurs in Europe or in Asia, the United States Congress would pass something called the Neutrality Act to basically announce, hey, we're not getting involved, we're staying neutral. There were restrictions that would go into effect anytime there was a war. One, they prohibited the sale of arms to either side. This, remember, was important because that's one of the reasons why the U.S. had been dragged into World War I. It also prohibited loans and credits to any country at war for the same reason. It forbade Americans from traveling on the vessels of countries at war to avoid a Lusitania-like situation. And if the countries at war wanted non-military goods, we would sell that to them. But they had to come and pick it up themselves, and they had to pay for us. They had to pay for it in cash. We wouldn't take credit or any other payment. So it was known as a cash and carry basis, but only non-military goods. That's what the law said. The original ones were passed in order to ban our involvement in the Spanish Civil War. And then as conflicts heated up elsewhere, we would pass new ones in 36 and 37. They did limit the ability of the president to respond to these threats. Then again, FDR wasn't really that interested in doing so, and in fact campaigned, just like Wilson had done during World War I, FDR campaigned on, bragging about how he had kept us neutral and out of the war. Anyways, this was a political cartoon that is criticizing the U.S. Senate being isolationist, and while at the same time we had business interests everywhere in the world, and our flag was flying in a bunch of different places as our ships traveled all over the world doing business and providing resources and supplies to both sides. So again, this is kind of criticizing the fact that we're claimed to be isolationist, even though we are supplying through the Neutrality Acts supplies, even if they're non-military, to foreign governments. 1936 Spanish Civil War. So the 35 Neutrality Act was in response to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. 36 Neutrality Act was in response to the Spanish Civil War. And in Spain in 1936, nationalists, who are really fascists, led by a guy named Francisco Franco, overthrow the government that's democratic. We passed the Neutrality Act to order our government to stay out of it. There are some Americans that fight, but they just go over there and volunteer to fight on their own. Anyways, the democracies do nothing, like the United States and Britain. Basically, we left the folks fighting for democracy to fight for themselves against, the Spanish fascists, who are supported not only by Italy, but also by Germany. Eventually, Russia sends some troops, but it's too late. Eventually, Spain falls to fascism, and Franco becomes another dictator. And eventually, Rome, Italy, and Germany sign the Rome-Berlin Axis, which is an alliance between the two. And they then help Franco to win, and then later on, Rome-Berlin is going to join with Tokyo when they ally with Japan as well. Speaking of Japan, while all that's going on, Japan invaded southern China in 1937. That's what prompts our other Neutrality Act. They want an empire in Asia. In response to that attack, Roosevelt gives a famous what's called quarantine speech. What he says is that we need to quarantine aggressive nations like Japan and Italy. However, it was condemned by isolationists and ridiculed by the public. In fact, afterwards, he was stung by the criticism so much that he actually scaled back his talk for a while about fighting back. So again, even in 1937, if he just spoke about, hey, maybe we should be a little bit more aggressive against these folks, he's running into he's running into isolationists and a public that really doesn't want to get involved. Anyways, that leads us to the Panay incident. The Panay was a ship that Japanese forces sunk. It was a U.S. ship that was in China. Japan attacked China. They surprise attacked it. They attacked a number of cities. They sunk an American ship, not realizing it was American. They thought it was Chinese. And they apologized, which was unusual because that's not something they normally did, because they knew FDR and the public were outraged. However, the public was more angry that we had a ship in the war zone more so than that it had been sunk. So again, it kind of shows the public's demand to stay out of the conflict, at least at this point in the 1930s. By the way, that was the Panay. during better times before it was sunk. Anyways, Germany as well, responsible for a ton of aggression, as you know from last year's classes. Hitler, too, withdraws from the League. He starts to build up Germany in defiance of the Versailles Treaty. Of course, Europe stands by and lets him. Remember, Germany had lost a ton as a result of the treaty, and so Hitler uses that to justify getting it back. And he builds up the military in order to do so. He takes out Austria. Remember, he annexes Austria. Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, right, remember, supports something called appeasement, where he gives in to Hitler in order to avoid a war. Doesn't work. Remember, Hitler just takes more and more. Then he takes Czechoslovakia. You don't really need to know this, to be quite honest with you. That's why I'm running through it quickly. Eventually, right, Hitler just continues to take and take. Britain originally lets him. Britain and France do. Right, this is criticizing Britain and France for giving Czechoslovakia to Germany. That's the German wolf. That's supposed to be Hitler. And then, of course, Germany starts to threaten Poland. Britain and France say, enough's enough. We're not going to let you take Poland. If you do, we'll declare war on you. So now there's a showdown. At the same time, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. It stuns the world. They promise not to attack each other. In fact, they decide to invade Poland together. And love that cartoon. There they are signing the... I love that cartoon, right? It's making fun of the fact they just signed the non-aggression pact. Joking around how long can it last. Right, because these guys are supposed to be enemies and they just signed this. There you go, there's Poland, right? She's Goldilocks. She just walked in on the monster sleeping in her bed. Oh no, she's doomed, right? Because now Germany and Russia have teamed up or have agreed not to fight, and that means Poland's stuck in the middle and they're both going to take half. Germany invades Poland. Of course, you know, England and France declare against Germany. The U.S., of course, stays neutral. Of course, it begins. Germany rolls across Poland. The Soviets also take eastern Poland. Germany rolls across Europe. France eventually falls to Germany as well, right? Hitler and Germany roll across. They try to invade Britain first. Famously, the British Air Force is able to beat them off. So they're unable to... You don't really need to know any of this European fighting. What you need to know is what's happening in the U.S. Okay. So the U.S. responds to the war. When Poland is invaded by Germany, we pass the Neutrality Act of 1939. That's like our fourth Neutrality Act. However, Britain and France needed supplies. They needed airplanes. They needed other war supplies. And so this one, for the first time in 1939, it allowed us to sell weapons to democracies only, on a cash and carry basis. So now we can sell weapons, but only to democracies, which made it pretty much automatic that it would be Britain and France, and cash and carry only, right? So you got to pick it up. We're not going to transport it. We don't want to get sunk by U-boats, and no credit. You got to pay for it in cash. In the same sense, FDR also declared places around the oceans that were danger zones where ships and citizens were not supposed to enter. So again, is this really what we want? This is another political cartoon. It's making fun of the Neutrality Act. It's making fun of the fact that a lot of Americans felt like if we passed Neutrality Acts, it somehow protected us from getting involved and kept us safe. And so this is making fun of by saying, is the Neutrality Act like, it can't do everything like some people think it should, or like it does. It's a Neutrality Act that'll keep us out of any war. It'll ensure the continuity. It'll act to curb the power of dictatorships, and it'll scrub floors and do the dishes in the spare time. It's just joking about the fact that some people thought that it was doing more than it actually was, and that it was somehow keeping us safe, when this cartoonist doesn't think it is, and thinks we need to be more aggressive in helping Britain and France. Anyways, as a result of the new Neutrality Act, the democracies do benefit. They control the Atlantic, so they benefit. The U.S. starts to recover from that recession we were in that had occurred during FDR's presidency. and the New Deal. Then shortly after the Neutrality Act, FDR gives his famous Arsenal of Democracy speech. For the first time, he says we can't remain neutral forever, that the Nazis are bad enough for world domination, and that we need to do something to help the Allies. We need to become the great warehouse, he says, which means we need to supply them with the weapons they need to fight. This is especially the case because Britain has just lost France. France has just fallen to Germany. Britain's fighting by itself, and it's fighting in the Battle of Britain, and it desperately needs U.S. supplies. Congress responds by giving the president billions of dollars to help rebuild our military, build our navy up, and start planning for war. It's around this time that the United States signs the Havana Conference. I hope this is in your notes. But this basically says the U.S. is going to start to patrol the Western Hemisphere with Latin American countries. Again, another symbol of our anti-imperialism. We start a draft, peacetime draft, 1940, well before we get into the war in December of 41. We initiate a peacetime draft to start to build up that military because we know we're going to potentially need to be prepared. September of 1940, and a move again towards helping the Allies and becoming more directly involved, FDR agrees to a deal where we sell 50 destroyers. Most of these are old ships that we sell to Britain. They desperately need them to defend themselves against submarines, U-boats. And we are, in return, we receive 8 military bases around the world, many of which we still have today. This is another move towards assisting the Allies against Germany and the Axis. Now, as this is occurring, there is a movement in this country to resist. There's a strong isolationist movement that exists. There's also a strong movement in this country that grows that says we do need to get involved in the war. The most famous group that supported us getting into the war was called the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies. They said we needed to intervene. They argued we couldn't let the Axis win. They argued that we had to build up, or otherwise we would be invaded or attacked at some point as well. They argued we should help Britain directly, and anything short of war we should move to right away. FDR kind of sympathized and agreed with them, but he knew the public wasn't in support, so he had to keep this quiet, at least until he was elected again. For the third time in 1940, and yes, you heard that right. Isolationists, on the other hand, argued against our involvement, and they were really strong. They were especially strong with the Republican Party. A lot of folks who had kept us out of the League also opposed entry into the war. The most famous civilian group was the America First Committee, and they argued that we needed to stay out and let England do the fighting. And then get involved if we needed to after England was defeated. They did argue we should protect our shoreline, but that we should not become directly involved in any way. They had the support of the famous Charles Lindbergh, who was a strong isolationist. They also had the support of a very famous and powerful congressman named Robert Taft, who argued we should not get involved. Anyways, 1940 election, yep, you heard it right. FDR decides, because of the extreme threat we're in and his popularity, really, he just decides because he's so darn popular, he's going to screw the tradition and he's going for a third term. He knows he can win, and he runs against a guy named Wendell Willkie. Just like 36, he rolls to the victory. Not as convincing, but still, you saw the numbers. 449 to 82, not close. Shortly after that, FDR gives his For Freedom speech. Now he says, hey, I need more authority to help Britain. There's 4 freedoms worth fighting for, he says. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear. He argues Britain's being threatened by these, and we need to act as the defender of democracy. Congress responds by passing the Lend Lease Act that gives him the power he needs. Famous piece of painting here that celebrates FDR's speech and efforts to help the Allies. When he gives that For Freedom speech, Congress passes this. It's the most significant law of World War I, or at least, I should say World War II, or the build-up to it. This is massive. This is probably what helps us to win the war more than anything. by really helping the other allies to do the fighting. It gives the U.S. authorization to give military supplies to any nation that the president, in this case FDR, said was vital to the defense of the U.S. And we said payment will be settled later. Critics argued, what do you mean? We're giving this to them without asking them to pay? That's a blank check. What if they never pay? FDR said, hey, we have to do it. He used an analogy. He said, hey, if your house is on fire, or I should say your neighbor's house is on fire, you loan him your hose, and then you worry about getting it back later. And he said, in this case, that's the case we're fighting with Britain against Germany. Anyways, even though we're not officially in the war, we may as well been after this. It's like an economic declaration for all intents and purposes. War production massively increased. We began to basically almost supply all of Britain's weapons and ammunition. Eventually, later on, we're going to supply massive amounts to the Soviets as well. $50 billion in weapons and ammunition we produced go to them so they can fight on the front lines. Again, as you can see, we spent tens of billions on weapons, on services, on materials, and on food products for the fight. And as you can see, it flowed all over, right? The biggest arrows here, right, flow to England, of course. Down here into Africa, right, where English troops were fighting, of course, into the Soviet Union, Australia, of course, getting some New Zealand, right? So each group's getting a little bit in support. Most of them are fighting either with the Soviets or with China, which was democratic at the time, or with other American allies, or fighting as part of the British Empire. Even before we're in the war, again, no declaration. We start to patrol the Atlantic more. We seized Greenland, we seized Iceland, so that they could not be occupied by Germany, because remember, if we control them, they're controlled by a neutral country, right? And so Germany would have to declare war to take them. Our convoys, we start to protect them with our Lend Lease shipments. We're now shipping them over ourselves. So we escort them half the way, and then the British escort them the remainder across the Atlantic. When German U-boats start to sink American ships, FDR orders us to start shooting them on sight. And here we go. Here's a cartoon of our shipping in a boxing match against German U-boats, and you can see Churchill and FDR are like the ring men. They're trying to help him out. They're trying to bandage him up and give him water and talk him into fighting. And the message is working on him, like strengthening him up, getting him strong enough so that he can fight back and actually respond to this U-boat crisis. Something that this cartoonist thinks FDR and Churchill probably should have done earlier. Then in August of 1941, well, first off, in June of 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. He stabbed Stalin in the back. He betrayed the non-aggression agreement they had. And in a surprise invasion, he invaded the Soviet Union. Shortly after, and then, of course, he took huge amounts of the Soviet Union. Look at this. And in 1941, look at the red is the area that Germany controlled in Europe and North Africa. Look at how much of the map they controlled. All the way up from Norway. Goodness gracious, craziness. Norway and Finland and Russia, all the way down to North Africa. Oh my goodness, they controlled everything. Remember, Spain's fascist. They're just neutral in the war. Portugal's neutral, right? Turkey's neutral, right? All of this is British, but, you know, Britain's barely hanging on. Oh my goodness, it's crazy. Sweden's neutral, so crazy. Anyways, the Atlantic Charter. In August, shortly after the Soviets got involved in the war, Roosevelt and Churchill met secretly on a ship in the Atlantic Ocean, right off the coast of North America, and they agreed to what became known as the Atlantic Charter. Stalin also agreed to it later, too. In it, they agreed that after the war was over, there would be no territorial changes, like there was after World War I, to avoid another conflict in the future. They also agreed democracies would be restored, and when the war was over, they would create the United Nations. Finally, Japan. While all of this was going on in Europe, with Germany just crushing over everybody and Britain being last to stand up, tensions were also heating up in the United States with Japan. And the problem was Japan was also rolling across Asia at the same time. Now, remember, they had seized Manchuria, northern China, and they claimed it for themselves. They renamed it Manchukuo. We refused to accept that. However, they seized it, of course, and made it unofficially part of their country. Then, remember, they invaded all of China shortly after and tried to seize all of China, and they took over a lot of it. Never were able to seize it all. Remember, they're trying to create a massive empire, and they're getting a lot of their oil and other resources from us as all of this is happening. So we started to embargo our products. We started to restrict our products to Japan in order to get them to try to stop this aggressive behavior. They didn't. It didn't. They started to seize more and more territory, so we continued to embargo them more and more. That caused them to kind of move more towards Germany and Italy, and they signed that alliance with them. In response, we moved our fleet to Hawaii to move a little closer to Japan in case we needed to use it. Then we had another embargo in 1941. We not only continued to freeze all those war products, we froze their money that we were keeping. We closed the Panama Canal to them. And the big one, we embargoed oil. They needed oil to fight the war. They needed it for their ships and their tanks and all their other weapons of war. And they needed it from us. So they negotiated with us. They were willing to maybe withdraw from part of China. We said, no, you need to withdraw from all of it. Their leader, a guy named Tojo, who was in charge of the government, even though there was an emperor, Tojo ran the government, basically decided, you know what, enough's enough. We're going to go to war eventually with the U.S. anyway, so we might as well try to sneak attack them while we can. Maybe we can knock them out of the war before they can use their incredible numbers and resources to beat us. So Japan planned a secret attack. They figured war was inevitable, and the only chance they would have is if they had some massive crippling attack to start and somehow were able to use it to defeat the U.S. At the same time they attacked us at Pearl Harbor, they also attacked across all of Asia. They seized much of Asia the same day, including the Philippines. Why they attacked Pearl Harbor? Because it was our major naval base in the Pacific. Our entire fleet was there. Fortunately, by this point, the major ship in navies was the aircraft carrier. It carried planes, and it allowed you to basically have floating air bases that you could just wreck shop on ships and planes and soldiers on the ground from your ships, from your carriers. Fortunately for the U.S., the carriers weren't in Pearl Harbor at the time. They were out to sea. But most of the rest of the fleet was, because we weren't expecting a Japanese attack. Anyways, the attack was a major success. It absolutely decimated the U.S. fleet. 8 battleships were destroyed, most famously the USS Arizona and Oklahoma. 2,500 American soldiers were killed. 1,100 were wounded. The next day, after December 7th, 1941, FDR asked for a declaration of war. He called it a date that will live in infamy. We declared war against Japan. A few days later, Germany and Italy declared war against us. They didn't have to. Big mistake by Hitler. Their alliance said that if Japan declared war, then they didn't have to, but Germany and Italy wanted to show their support. That was a big mistake. Otherwise, he could have bought time and not fought against the U.S. for a while. Anyways, these are images of the ships getting attacked and kind of exploding. That's an image of FDR signing the declaration. Oh, more ships. Okay. So anyways, that's that. I'm going to skip through all of these and call it a night and a break. All right, folks. Hope this helps. Get through this quickly. Mr. M, out.